Hi, this is your host with Minute Earth. When you think of an Arctic animal that's perfectly suited to its environment, you might be thinking of a polar bear. After all, its fur and blubber help it stay warm in frigid temperatures. And its paws are big and round so it can walk on top of the snow without sinking. But when you take a closer look at polar bears, you realize that some of their features aren't necessarily ideal for life in the Arctic. Sure, their fur keeps them warm, but it also makes them super smelly. And while their large paws do help them walk on snow, they're not great for catching fish. So what gives? Why aren't polar bears better suited to their environment? Well, it turns out that a lot of what makes polar bears is actually the result of evolution working with what it has got, not necessarily making the ideal adaptations. For example, polar bears have 2 nostrils. That might seem like just one too many holes for an animal that lives in an environment where every part of its body has to work super hard to keep it alive. Nostrils basically increase the surface area of your body, which means more opportunities for heat to escape or for water to get in. Having 2 nostrils would have been a disadvantage for our fishy-smelling friends. But they have 2 nostrils because, well, all land mammals have 2 nostrils. It's not like evolution could just decide to change that. Natural selection can only act on the variation that exists in a population. So if a bear happened to have 3 nostrils, it probably wouldn't have any more offspring than a bear with 2. So, 2 nostrils it is. That means that although polar bears today aren't necessarily optimally suited to their environment, they are well suited to life as land mammals. Being a land mammal is a pretty sweet gig. All things considered, land critters generally have it easy compared to their ocean-dwelling counterparts. They don't have to worry about getting lost in a current or washed up on shore, stuck there without a way to get back into the water. And there's dry land to escape to when you need a break from the water. Life on land is so easy, in fact, that most major animal groups have made the transition from water to land at least once during their evolutionary history. And somewhere along the way, an ancient whale relative crawled up on land to give birth, where it was met by a group of opportunistic bears. This was millions of years ago. Mind you, long before modern whales and polar bears split from each other. But because both groups can trace their ancestry back to that ancient bear. Scientists can learn about how these ancestors gave rise to modern-day polar bears and whales by studying the animals that are alive today. For example, we know that polar bears are the only extant that's living members of the brown bear family that specialize in life in the Arctic, but they share a lot of traits with their ursine cousins, including the genetic toolkit used to build skulls. By comparing skull-building genes between polar bears. Brown bears and other related species, researchers have figured out when genes changed and what those changes did. They found that one gene, named after the Greek letter theta, plays a big role in determining skull shape in bears. The team showed that different versions of the skull-building gene produced different shaped skulls in brown bears, and when they introduced the polar bear version of the gene into brown bear cells in a lab, they grew up with polar bear-shaped skulls. And sure enough, polar bear skulls looked different from brown bear skulls. The team concluded that changes in this gene, which ultimately control the shape of your skull, might have been a key factor in the evolution of polar bears from brown bears. But wait! If polar bears evolved from brown bears, why don't brown bears live in the Arctic? Well, it turns out that although polar bears and brown bears can interbreed, they don't often. Brown bears typically live far from the Arctic, and the two don't generally run into each other in the wild. So the ancestors of polar bears were able to carve out a niche for themselves in the Arctic without much competition from brown bears. That doesn't mean they evolved into polar bears overnight, though. Estimates suggest that polar bears and brown bears shared a common ancestor about 600,000 years ago. But they've been diverging from each other for at least 500,000 years. And they still aren't done evolving. Researchers think that polar bears are still becoming better suited to their environment today, thanks to natural selection. Since the 1970s, the average snout-to-tail length of polar bears has increased by about 3%. That might not sound like much, but it's actually a pretty significant change on an evolutionary time. especially considering that polar bears haven't changed much in the fossil record over the past 2 million years. So, perhaps polar bears aren't perfectly suited to their environment today. But given enough time, evolution might just get us there. Speaking of which, if you're enjoying this video, you might want to subscribe so you don't miss our future episodes. Thanks for watching!